this actually plays out in practice and how this starts to actually create a platform that does more than just containers. So the first thing to talk about is that Kubernetes itself is a layered system. A lot of ways that we think about this is it's kind of in the Unix philosophy, where you have a bunch of small things that then actually layer on top of each other. And then oftentimes these things can be used in multiple ways, sometimes in ways that the original authors didn't actually plan them to be used. And so this is actually one of the things that I think makes Kubernetes both complicated because we have all these different layers, but also very powerful because you can use these layers in interesting ways. So at the bottom we have this primitive called a pod. I said it's about equivalent to a container. What we did is we expanded the idea of container instead of just being one process, essentially a set of processes that share some state between them. And so this has enabled us to be able to do things like sidecars that have enabled things like service meshes. There's a bunch of scenarios where you want to run a bunch of closely related containers together. So that's a pod. And then building on top of a pod. So a pod is actually a single set of containers running on a single machine. But oftentimes when you're building distributed systems, you don't want to run a single container. You want to run a bunch of copies of that container. And so that's where we get to this controller called a replica set. And so controller logic oftentimes is very, very simple. A replica set says, okay, I have a number of replicas, copies of this pod that I want to have. I'm going to wake up. I'm going to look and see how many copies are out there. If there's too many, let me go ahead and delete some of those pods. If there's not enough, let me create some new pods to actually replace the ones that I don't have. Right? And so that way, if the user adjusts the numbers of pods, the logic stays the same. If a machine disappears and some of these pods die, the logic stays the same. So that controller doesn't know whether you increase the number of replicas. All it knows is that the number of pods it sees and the number of pods that you asked for, those things are different. It's going to try and correct that and make relentless forward progress. So that's, I think, the best example, the simplest example of a simple control loop and what a controller looks like.